All right. Good afternoon, everybody. Happy Monday to you, wherever you may be. I am here in cloudy and somewhat rainy San Francisco. Keisha, it looked like you were somewhere very nice with blue skies out in the world. I hope others of you are also in places where it's nicer. Um, we're going to continue with talking about Emil Durkheim. This will probably be our last week of talking about Durkheim. We left off almost through most of his book on suicide. That's where we'll pick up today, and then we'll be looking at his work called The Elementary Forms of Religious Life. For the announcements, you should notice that on Canvas you have a quiz that opened up today. In fact, just opened up right when class started at 12:30. Um, just like with the first quiz about Marx, there are 20 questions that are multiple choice and true false. You have a week to answer those questions. You can open up the quiz, look at the material, look at the questions, come back to it. As long as you submit all of your answers by this time next week. So 12:30 p.m. October 20th is when that's due. Like I said, this probably will be the last week on Durkheim. Um, I'm running a little bit behind in the discussion. So I'll make a judgment call before Wednesday's class if we need to spend an extra class about Durkheim. Um, if that's the case, then I will push back the due date for the quiz and the next perusal assignment until Wednesday, the 22nd. But let's see how far we get today. Like I said, we're about 2/3 of the way, I would say, through Durkheim's book on suicide, but we have still some important points to touch on today. And then the elementary forms of religious life is a pretty complicated work, so we may need to spend more than one class on that. So if we need to take an extra day on with Durkheim, that'll be fine. I've looked into the schedule and, kind of looking ahead. We've got a fair amount of flexibility, and, in the scheduling, things that we can kind of push around to make sure that, we can spend a little more time on Durkheim without losing out on other folks. Okay, that, as I can remember, are the only announcements for right now. Unless there are questions from those of you who are here, and thank you for being here. But if you have questions, feel free to raise them, especially about, if it's about like nuts and bolts stuff about the class and the schedule looking forward. Hey, I will take that as a no. Um, I'm glad everything is clear. We're like halfway through the semester now. How about that, huh? This is like week 8, uh, and things are just flying by. Seems like just yesterday I was totally confused and overwhelmed with how to use perusal and all this kind of stuff. Just like technologically overwhelmed. And now here we are. We're like, we're cruising through. It's been a pretty fun experience. I've really especially enjoyed the conversations that we've had online on the about the readings, um, and I've enjoyed too the participation here in the Zoom sessions. Um, but I especially like this, these kind of written online forums that we're having discussing the reading. So that's what we're going to pop into right now with Durkheim on suicide. And if you'll remember where we sort of left off in discussing this work, Durkheim was basically, you know, trying to make a case for sociology as a scientific discipline. And so he took up the study of suicide because, it was something that was, generally assumed to be a psychological or a personal problem that was therefore the domain of psychology. Whereas what Durkheim wanted to do was demonstrate the utility for sociology in explaining this phenomenon of suicide. And so he's sort of done this dive into the statistical data, into suicide rates of various groups in various countries and various times as a way to kind of show that sociology can have a role in explaining why suicide rates are higher or lower among certain kinds of groups. And in the preceding kind of discussion, he's talked about, kind of one of the biggest factors are situations of social instability, where the previous like equilibrium that held social order in place is falling apart, where the social fabric is coming apart at the seams. That's when we see these upticks in the suicide rate. And he says, it happens certainly during like times of economic crisis, um, you know, uh, recessions in which, or depressions in which people lose their jobs and, their place in society more generally. But it also happens even in good times, in boom times, when the previous order or stability of society is kind of shaken. There's a kind of an earthquake that disrupts the traditions and the communities that people had presumed to be stable. So what Durkheim is doing here is to use the suicide study as a means for building his larger social theory, for arguing for sociology as something uh, as a discipline, but also for just more generally for arguing about why society is so important in the lives of people, how we must have these kinds of social bonds, that we are, basically social creatures, who we are social beings who must have some kind of connection to other people. Otherwise, all of these kind of pathological symptoms result. And this is something that's very significant in our own time, in our society. I was just seeing over the weekend the new studies that have come out about loneliness in America, and especially loneliness among young people. They do these surveys where they ask people, do you have um, five friends besides your, like immediate family members? Do you have five close friends? They've been asking this for years as part of this survey. And the number of people who say that they do not have five close friends has increased significantly in just the past 10 years. In fact, I think I don't remember the numbers exactly, but I think it was close to half of adults that said that they don't have five close friends outside of their immediate circle of family members. And they also ask people, how much time do you spend alone during the course of the day? Um, and that number has also increased dramatically in since the last time that question was asked. I think in 2014, the number was somewhere that people spend between 5 and 6 hours alone. It was something like 5.5 maybe per day, not counting sleep. And when they took that survey more recently, that number had jumped up to almost 7 hours a day. Um, and uh, so that's a significant increase in just a 10-year period. And then finally, the last number that I saw was when they asked young people, I think in people in high school, how many people say that they feel extremely alone. How many high school seniors, say this? And again, this is a question they've been asking for a number of years, so we can compare the data over time. And that number has also significantly increased. That was the one that I think made me kind of the saddest, was to think about, what, again, I think the number was close to half. I don't remember the exact number, but it was close to 50% of high school seniors say that, they feel extremely alone. All of this I find to be very sad on a personal level, but also very disturbing on a sociological level, for the very reasons that Durkheim um, illuminates, which is that a lonely society is a society full of lonely people is a dangerous society. It is a society prone to violence, to all sorts of antisocial kinds of behavior. Um, it is a society of kind of like where everyone is divided and adrift. And Durkheim thinks this is a dangerous thing. Go ahead, Kai. I'd love a question or comment from you.
Hey, sorry, I missed the last class. I
That's
had to
okay.
work, but I find Durkheim to be interesting because yeah, it's crazy, just like you said, everything that's going on. And then I don't know, I just feel like with a lot of people not having kids and then just like people just losing like interest in their jobs and stuff just because of like, profit over people and everything. I
Yeah,
just feel like, like if people don't have like purpose or meaning, then like they feel like what's the point?
very well said. Yeah, and I think we have a lot of people in our society who feel really disconnected. They feel socially disconnected from other people. I think, like you said too, Kai, they feel disconnected from any kind of larger purpose or meaning. And I think Durkheim is kind of suggesting that we need that as human beings. You know, um, I don't think he doesn't really seem to care what it is that we believe in. He's not like making a lot of moral judgments about like, oh, this is what people should believe. To go back to my example from this whole semester, I've been making jokes about. Um, People could worship Labubus for all Durkheim cares. The important thing is that they have some kind of a social bond, that they have some kind of a social connection.
Do you feel like it's like repurposed tribalism, like
Yeah.
tribalism kind of kept us like, when we were like hunter gatherers and stuff, like tribalism was essential because it essentially helped like kept us alive and like the institutions that he talks about do you feel like structural institutions and all that, do you feel like it's just like all repurposed tribalism at the end of the day?
Yeah. Um, in some ways, this is going to be his point when he talks about the elementary forms of religious life, because in that book, Durkheim goes back to so-called primitive religions among like Aboriginal people in Australia, and generally among like indigenous people. And he talks about this thing called totemism, where people, you know, were divided into like clans, different sort of, you know, like social groups, basically. And the totems would kind of represent the clan, so the totem could be anything. It could, a rattlesnake, a cockroach, an owl. It was usually some sort of an animal or a plant. But the important thing about the totem was that it represented the clan, the tribe, as you say, right? Like that there's this thing that people felt a connection to, and it didn't really matter what the thing was. Like I said, it could be a labubu. Like who cares? The important thing is the social unity of the group. And they need some kind of a thing, a totem, a flag, a symbol, a set of beliefs, rituals, and rites. They need these things, to affirm their social connections. And when people don't have those social connections, Durkheim is suggesting, then you really have a breakdown of like social order. You have a breakdown of morality, because Durkheim believes that morality is, fundamentally a social product, and so you have people doing, all kinds of self-destructive or antisocial kinds of behavior. And, you know, like I've said before, sometimes I feel like we're living in Durkheim's worst nightmare. In he was afraid that this was what things would become if you just had a society full of individuals who are just competing with one another, and who are trying to, in some ways, like use each other or get something out of the other. If individuals view each other in this kind of instrumentalized, alienated way, without seeing our common solidarity, without recognizing our interdependence on one another, then Durkheim thought we were going to be in real trouble. And especially on my gloomier days, I feel like this might be this you might have accurately forecast this. Thank you, Kai. Um, so this is where Durkheim is going to sort of go into, like, I would say kind of his idea of human nature. I'm not sure I totally agree with him on this, but his idea of human nature as it relates to society is that people need society to kind of like regulate them, to be an external constraint over people. And here in this second part of the discussion in Suicide is where he kind of goes into this. He starts up here. He's talking about animals, um, and talking about the sort of the needs of animals. Um, and then in the following paragraph, talking about humans, and what sort of separates human beings from other animals in terms of our needs. And the thing is that with humanity, um, needs and desires are potentially unlimited. Whereas he's saying like animals, they have a certain finite set of needs for, you know, food and their environment and, certain kinds of like physical material needs that have to do with their relationship to the natural environment. But with people, it's like there's no ceiling. There's no limit on what people can need or want or desire. There's no ceiling on our passions. And I think Durkheim's basically suggesting that that's where the trouble starts. Is that you know is that there's no cap on our as a species on what we need, want, or desire. And so that's where society has to come in. Society has to be like a good parent and say like, no, no, no. It has to draw the boundaries and show us the limits. It has to serve as an external constraint over people. And if we don't have that external constraints, if we're just kind of left to our own device as people, we're going to get ourselves into trouble because there's no such thing as too much. There is no such thing as like enough. We want it all, we want it now, and we want more of it. That's basically, I think, like what Durkheim is suggesting here in this paragraph. And he will say that, this is, if you'll remember, I talked about this sentence at the end because I think it summarizes it so well, that inextinguishable thirst is constantly renewed torture. And this is, what Buddhism and many other religions have identified this as the source of human suffering. That to desire, to want is almost like the root of suffering. And so Durkheim is kind of suggesting that society, like a responsible parent, has to step in and be a sort of a moral constraint that tells us no. It's similar to, if any of you have studied the ideas of Freud. Freud has this idea that the psyche is composed of these different components that are in conflict with one another. There's the id, there's the ego, and there's the superego. And the id is like, the little kid in us that's like in a candy store. And it's just like the id is just like, I want it, I want it, I want it, like whatever it is, and it's kind of up to the superego to be like, pop up on the other shoulder and say like, no, no, no. The superego is kind of like the way that we have internalized the social norms and expectations, to translate it back into sociological language. Yeah, I'm just looking at your comment here, Mason. Yeah, I certainly agree with your sentiment here that COVID accelerated those numbers that I was talking about earlier with regard to the loneliness epidemic in America. And uh, and I think that would explain also why it's so rampant among young people. It's so much worse among the younger generation, so I think that's an astute observation. Thank you. All right. So,
Professor?
yo,
Oh, sorry. I was checking on speaker. Sorry I'm late. I was at a grad class thing they were doing from
okay.
12 to 1. But another thing that I wanted to ask you, not to interrupt, the quiz, is it supposed to be due at 11:30 today? Right now? Earlier right now?
No, did I mess that up? That
It
it
said
shouldn't.
12:30 p.m., so it's down as late.
So,
For not to interrupt.
there's like some feedback or something going on there. Okay. Let me check to make sure that I didn't mess this up. It's certainly not supposed to continue today.
Are you echoing for everybody or just me?
I think just for you.
Oh gosh, I'm gonna log out.
Honestly, having a pretty psychedelic effect. Okay, let me see this.
Oh, I figured it out. I was logged in.
Oh, I did mess this up. Okay, thank you. Let me just change this really quickly.
Okay, because I was about to say, do you need a doctor's note? Because my quiz is late.
Nope. No, I think I am the one that needs a doctor's note because have made a mistake here. Okay, how do I do this?
Mistakes are the breaking points of new discovery.
Like that. Um,
It just came off my noggin.
what's that?
I
How do
said
I
it just
change the
came off the
date?
top of my noggin.
Oh, at the top of your noggin.
Yeah.
I was like, I thought that was some sort of new site or app or something.
No, but don't quote me because I do a
Noggin.com.
lot of reading, so I could have picked it up from somebody and I don't remember. So let's not quote me.
Okay, there it is. Sorry. Okay. Sorry about that. It's all fixed now. Where's my thing gone?
And I know you probably got it listed in a syllabus, but I was just wondering, what is your final for this class? Our midterms. Do you do those?
No. I mean, we've got basically like you've got perusal assignments. You'll have like another quiz. I can't remember if there's at least one. There might be two, but no.
Oh, you're just amazing. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay. I don't know. Can't remember at the moment, but it's in the syllabus for sure. Just one more minute. Just when I was congratulating myself at the beginning of class for like figuring out the technological stuff, stirs me right. I just like cursed myself by uh, just when you think you got something figured out, it's like life throws you a new obstacle. Okay, which one are we on here? We're on number 6 still. And we're back. So this point with Um, this point with the idea that society needs to externally regulate the individual. This is important for these reasons that I talked about, but also because Durkheim basically believes that what happens in a modern industrial capitalist society is that those limits, those guardrails basically disappear. That now it becomes, possible to imagine unfathomable amounts of wealth. And the idea is that everybody can succeed, that even like the poorest person, growing up in the projects can turn out to be like the next Jay-Z, or LeBron James or, whatever, like, um, you know, the idea is that like that there is no sort of limit to the imagination. And he compares that, you remember last time I talked about in Ireland. He says in Ireland, you would think that there's higher suicide rates, at least at the time, because, there's so much poverty, so much misery, such high rates of alcoholism, and so forth. But he said actually the suicide rate is kind of low because there's a sort of a stability in that misery that people have, experienced what sociologists call absolute deprivation, which is that people are poor and they've always been poor, and everyone around them is poor, and every generation has always been poor. They have no reason to expect anything except deprivation. Whereas like, if you are poor but surrounded by symbols of wealth, you know, and there are people, who you can point to and say like, well, they made it, they got theirs. Why can't I get mine? Or how am I going to get mine? This is the kind of thing sociologists call relative deprivation. When you're deprived, but you have this kind of added insult of being surrounded with non-deprivation, you know, and this, in some ways, this is sociologists say, kind of like this is the stuff that makes people like riot. This is the stuff that really um, taps into a lot of collective anger and frustration because people are able to imagine that things could be different, and they're not. They're not different, but they can imagine them as being, or hope for them, or want them. There's this gap that's opened up between their desires and their reality, and that's a real kind of explosive thing. And so Durkheim is saying that in modern industrial society, this is the thing that happens. Whereas in traditional societies, in so-called primitive societies, where there was mechanical solidarity, nobody had any reason to expect anything different. You were just like in this small little traditional village community, and you might be poor or even on the brink of starvation, but there was a limit to your desires. There was a cap on your ambitions. And in a modern industrial capitalist society, those guardrails disappear, those limits disappear. And in some ways, it kind of makes it people even more miserable, I think. So this is a lot of the discussion of what he calls regulation. So the term regulation is meant to indicate how society is supposed to is supposed to externally constrain the individual. Like I've said a couple of times already, it's how regulation is how society is supposed to act like a responsible parent. You know, it says no and tells their kid what they can't do. But the other concept is integration. It kind of goes along with regulation. So integration, Durkheim is not totally clear on how this is different. It's in this paragraph here. Integration, though, is kind of more when people kind of voluntarily consent to join social groups. So every society has to have some combination. It can't just simply be pure regulation and external constraint. There has to be a component also of integration in which people voluntarily consent to join groups. They integrate into the society. And so you have to sort of have both of those in order to have a functional society. You know, you kind of need society to say no, but you also need individuals to like buy in and say yes. So this is sort of where he's turning in this part of the discussion, in this section of the reading, towards this question of integration. He has less to say about this, but you know, it's still important. And so the idea is that with integration is that it's like internalized by the individual, and it has, as he says here, man's characteristic privilege is that the bond he accepts is not physical but moral, that is social. He is governed not by a material environment brutally imposed on him, but by a conscience superior to his own, the superiority which he feels. So this is kind of like Freud's concept of the superego that I mentioned a moment ago, where we internalize this moral voice so that it's not just like some external thing telling us no, it's also that we have internalized this as a kind of like self-discipline, you know, where we know like, okay, I can't eat 8 donuts for breakfast, even though it sounds really delicious. Like, I can't do that. You know, so instead of it only being like an external thing that says like, no, 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 we have also this kind of internalized, what Freud would call a superego, which is now kind of like part of ourselves and not just like some external thing out there. So this is the sort of like the need for this kind of internalization. And Durkheim's idea is that that things get real dangerous in these moments of crisis and transition and accelerated change because they disrupt this whole kind of this fragile equilibrium in which people have been living relative to their social group. So, like, if the individual really needs society to sort of like regulate and integrate them, then when society gets out of whack, um, then it has this destabilizing effect on individuals. And again, it's crucial to remember that these can be good or bad transitions, or transitions that are defined as good or as bad. That any sudden change, any kind of disequilibrium, is going to result in a is lead to an uptick in suicide. And I think, yeah, the question there that you raised, Mason, I think is correct. Um, I don't know that he would take it down to the level of an individual. Um, I would think that he would say more like a society that is in transition and is unstable is going to see an uptick in suicide rates. Whether he would deduce that all the way down to the question that you've asked, I'm not so sure, because Durkheim's not doing like risk assessment of individuals or something. He's not like, oh, what kind of individuals are more prone to suicide. He's thinking more on the level of society, and not so much about individuals. Remember that for Durkheim, society is the unit of analysis. Society is the starting point.
I guess I was thinking more like groups of people, like how like during like the Dust Bowl or whatever, like when things get hard for like farmers and like in agriculture, how they may be more likely to like, I know like they have higher rates of suicide. So like I was thinking more like, like that's a group of people affected by, like times of economic instability. So like with their ability to like when it's hard for like like a why can't I think of the word? Um, I don't know. Like a group of people, like if it's hard for them to find their stability, would that make them more prone, I guess?
Yeah, I believe so. Like, migrants and refugees and people who have been forced off their land in some way or another, because in doing so they've been forced off their land, but also like their communities are being broken apart. Um, their sort of ways of life, that they had attached to, are falling apart. Um, yeah, in those kinds of situations, um, I would believe so. Although, I also think like, well, in those kinds of situations, it depends on how um, closely people feel connected to their fellow migrants and refugees. So if they have a really close bond, like with their family, their kinship group, with their community, and people are all migrating at the same time, or they're all refugees, who have to flee their land at the same time, it probably creates an even stronger bond among them, and people don't want to let each other down by offing themselves individually. So that's where the situation gets kind of tricky, because like, ultimately, again, Durkheim is suggesting that what makes people less prone to suicide is an intensity of social connection. And in times of war and disaster and forced migration, like the kind that you mentioned, um, it serves to strengthen the bonds between people. Even when it's like they're all being like persecuted or deprived collectively. Do you know what I mean?
I think on one of the little sentence paragraphs, I wrote this down when you talked about how there's like a lower suicide rate in Ireland and like other low
Mhm.
income poverty areas or whatever. I had said that would that partly be because of the way their communities are organized? Like how I think it was in a different class, but there's like a somewhere in Japan or Okinawa or something like that. they have a social system where at birth, these kids are put into like a group with several other kids, and that's like their lifelong friends they grew up with, like so
Yeah.
that no matter what happens, they have like a social network of some sort. So like my question was, do we think that maybe these areas with lower suicide rates have like stronger social networks and support systems, whereas like, even though we're like a higher economic country or whatever, we don't have a very strong sense of community at all. And how Marx talked about like we're alienated from like ourselves and like our societies. Like, do we think that maybe that's what causes us to have like higher suicide rates than countries like that? Because even though we're better off economically, we don't like, we don't know how to make social bonds or anything like that.
Yeah, that's very well put. That's, I think, pretty much exactly what Durkheim would say, is that it's about the strength of the social connections that people have to one another, so that therefore, even in poor countries, so-called underdeveloped or backward countries, you might have a lower suicide rate than you do in a high income country like the United States, where there is undeniably greater economic prosperity, but uh, there's just rampant disconnection that people feel, and the sense of alienation, as you
One
mentioned.
other thing I had said too was that would it also partly be because, if you have a smaller community, like what everyone does counts, so like if you off yourself, well then that's like you're doing a blow to your community because no one can provide the way you were providing. Whereas here, say, I worked at Walmart and I do whatever, they're
Yeah,
just gonna find someone else to work at Walmart. It's not like as impactful as if like I lived in like a small village and like I was the water bearer or something like that, if that makes sense.
yeah, it does. Yeah, that is the fact of interdependence that Durkheim talks about, when people recognize that they need each other, and this is the condition of solidarity. This is, that sense of, of like purpose. That, yeah, the village needs a water carrier, and people come to attach a certain importance to their role in the division of labor, and they recognize that other people need them. So Durkheim is saying, like, people committed suicide in those kinds of village communities, but they did it for different reasons. Like, they did it because, like, they brought shame on themselves or dishonored themselves in front of the group. So, like, you let people down as the water carrier and everybody knows it. And, like, you in some way or another didn't live up to the responsibility that you had to the group. And so the shame, the social kind of shame is really intense, because everybody knows, like, you screwed up. Or it's like, you're sick, or you're not able to carry out your duties or responsibilities. If you're a liability to the group, if you're holding them back in some way, or making it so that they're vulnerable to attack, then, then people would commit suicide for, like, altruistic reasons, as a sacrifice of themselves for the sake of the group. So those are situations in which, like, the strength of the group, the strength of regulation, and the strength of integration can cause the suicide rate to increase. But in modern society, it's usually not. That's not the case. In modern society, it's usually like it's because the individual is so disconnected from their society and from other people, and individuals are kind of just alone and adrift. You know, as that's sort of like Durkheim's diagnosis. Yeah, good question. So this is kind of like where he discusses this sort of thing, like about the problem with capitalism, even in the best of times, is that it unleashes these previous sources of restraints. It takes the guardrails off. It creates these unlimited appetites, and thus deregulates people from what had been the limits, the moral constraints that have been put on their passions and their ambitions. It's like now, it's like, um, you know, years ago, there was that album by 50 Cent, Get Rich or Die Trying, you know. That is basically like the thing that Durkheim is sort of suggesting. And then here is the sort of the antithesis of that, where he starts talking about poor countries. This is part of what Mason had referred to in the previous comment about. He says here, poverty protects against suicide because it is a restraint in itself. No matter how much one acts, desires have to depend upon resources to some extent. Actual possessions are partly the criterion of those aspired to. So the less one has, the less he is tempted to extend his range of his needs indefinitely. Lack of power, compelling moderation, accustoms men to it, while nothing excites envy if no one has superfluity. Um, so yeah, it's like if we don't have, if we've been taught that basically nothing more is possible, and that this is just like all we got, and all we'll ever get, and all we can ever expect, then it sort of lowers our um, expectations, and people come to expect, impoverishment generation after generation. And this is what, as I mentioned, is what sociologists call absolute deprivation. And then here is where he starts talking about how, he says, for a whole century, economic progress has mainly consisted in freeing industrial relations from all regulation. So this is as clear as he gets about saying that modern societies with their capitalist economies, they basically take the guardrails of restraint off, and societies become, dysregulated. And so he's describing in this paragraph in general how religion used to provide that function. Religion traditionally provided the social and moral restraints. It traditionally exercised discipline over individual ambitions, and at the same time, religion gave people this larger explanation, um, for their why things were the way that they were, and what people should do, what a moral person should do. And so all of this kind of like blows up in the modern world. And he says, like, in the next paragraph, actually, religion has lost most of its power. And government, instead of regulating economic life, has become its tool and its servant. So now it's like, the corporations and the rich people are the ones that have the power over the government. And so all of these institutions that used to regulate people's desires are now, kind of have melted away in the face of this kind of economic power, this power of capitalism. Yeah, go ahead, Mason.
Is he talking about like religion as like a belief system or like religion as an institution? Because like I would still say like in today's modern society, with like us being more like Christian nationalists now,
Yeah.
there's that's like under religion, but
Mhm.
it's not like, we're following the church's orders. It's more like we're doing things under like a belief system, I guess. But I don't know if he's talking about back when like, like the main government, I guess, was like the church, if that makes
Yeah.
sense.
Yeah. I Well, it's hard to answer because he's not very specific about it, of whether he means the sort of the belief system or the institution. Um, and I would think that he would suggest it's kind of both, when he says religion has lost most of its power. Um, I think he certainly believes that it has lost its power over individuals' belief systems, in terms of the way people make sense of the world and their understanding of why things happen. I think he's also talking about it in the institutional term too, that like the church is less powerful than corporations or the government. Whereas like in the Middle Ages, say, the church was the most dominant and most powerful institution in society. And under capitalist society, I mean, the church is still there, but it's not as powerful as the bank, you know, like it's not as powerful as like the corporation. Those become the preeminent institutions, finance and industry, and religion. Is like the church is somewhere like probably like a distant third or fourth behind the government and media. Those become really the dominant forms of social organization. So my educated guess as to the answer to your question is he means both. Precious, you had a hand up.
No, I was just gonna piggyback off what you guys were saying about how the church has lost like the power that it once held over society.
Mm-hmm.
And I just want to add to that. I think that it's similar to the same thing with the Norse gods. It's just um dur- I would say that I don't know how to explain, like Christ came about in a period of time that people needed this higher this something for the soul. I don't know how to word it, but it's something that
Uh-huh.
just helps you cope with everyday life. And as
Uh-huh.
times has progressed and science has evolved, it has less explanations and more demands than it has explanations for its creation. And
Huh.
I think just knowledge is another reason why people have pretty much regained their own power of their lives and said, it is what it is. But yeah, just that.
Yeah. I think you're right on when you said that that the function of religion, I can't remember exactly how you put it, but it was that it's become less about explanation and more about like demands. I think that's those are the words that you used. And
Yes.
yeah, okay, right. So that like what religion, traditionally has done is to offer people Durkheim calls it a cosmology, like a way of understanding the big sort of existential questions like why are we here? How did we get here? What are we supposed to do? You know, those big kinds of questions traditionally were the domain of religion. And I think that it's kind of lost some of that power, a lot of that power. And as you said, Precious, it's become more oriented towards demands. I mean, Mason also mentioned, Christian nationalism, and I was discussing this with you, a couple of you also on perusal about these questions about the Christian nationalist movement today. And it seems to me that that is less about the kind of definition that Durkheim gives us about religion, which is that it's supposed to give us a kind of an explanation of a way of making sense of things and a sense of meaning and purpose. And is really more like that Christian nationalism is really more a sort of an like a sort of an authoritarian hierarchy or authoritarian kind of movement that I would say is actually more political than religious. First of all, I think it uses the language of religion and the discourse of religion, but it's really more about politics. Um, and it's much more it's like a kind of an authoritarian interpretation or authoritarian revision of Christianity that in many cases I think does not look at all like the kind of Christianity that Jesus Christ preached, which was much more about like helping people and especially the sort of the most underprivileged of us. Like how is it Christian to take away people's Medicare and Medicaid so that you can give tax breaks to billionaires? How is it Christian to have like ICE having snatching people up off the street and throwing them in these horrible detention facilities? That's just like distinctly unchristian. I think by any kind of interpretation. I don't. It's not. I'm not the person to arbitrate like what is Christian or what isn't Christian. That's I'm not going to step into that role. But that seems to me to be patently contradictory to the teachings of Jesus in the Sermon on the Mount and other places where he talked about the need to look out for the least fortunate among us. I don't really see like Christy Nome and Stephen Miller as people who are fulfilling that in any kind of way. If anything, these people seem kind of cartoonishly evil to me. I don't want to get in a sermon of my own here, but like this is again like this kind of example goes to show that like what religion is today is something that has lost a lot of its power. And that's literally what this sentence says. Actually, religion has lost most of its power. So that even the thing that postures as religion, the thing that calls itself religion, doesn't really do what religion used to do. Religion used to give people a sense of meaning and purpose and spiritual connection to other people and sense of community and social bonds. And I think really what it's doing now is giving people an excuse to sort of hate and oppress and marginalize other
They're
people.
weaponizing it.
Yeah, weaponizing, exactly. And it's pretty gross to be living through that moment, So yeah, I would say even religion, even the thing that calls itself religion today is a hollow shell of its former self.
My only question, I guess, with that is like, do you think that that was like, we're at the pinnacle of it. Would you say that that's like something that kind of developed over time? Because I wanted to say that what we have isn't really about religion, it's about control. But then I always think about like Martin Luther's time, back in like England and all that. when they wouldn't like, you know, the church was like the leading power, and like
Mhm.
they kind of like they wouldn't teach people to read and all that, and they're really against the printing press, and like there was a really big control on information. Like, would you say that that type of behavior, like repeated through history, is kind of like what's eroded people's like trust in religion, sort of, because we know that people will weaponize it?
Yeah, that's a really important point, Mason. It's not like, people like this just started yesterday. And I think to go back to the days of Martin Luther and the Protestant Reformation, um, against the same kind of dynamics that were apparent in organized Christianity, where it was very hierarchical, it was very authoritarian, it was very like, you have to do as the priest says, and we'll tell you what this text says, we'll tell you what's in the Bible. Um, that uh, so this kind of like authoritarian dimension of organized religion is a pretty consistent kind of feature. So I would agree that it's important not to think that this is something that just started with like American Christian nationalism. No, no, no. It is something that I think developed over a long period of time. Durkheim, after all, is writing this text more than 100 years ago, uh, and so he, I think, would say that what has happened in the modern world is just that the pace of that change has accelerated. Um, that the society, modern society, in modern society, the real gods are money and commodities, some money and stuff. Those are the things that people really worship. Um, Somebody asked me on the perusal, like if I believed in a church of Labubus, if there was a church of Labubus, and I said no, but I do think that like in our society, people um, do like kind of worship money and stuff, like you know their lives revolve around this in the same way that like 400 or 500 years ago people's lives revolved around religion. um you know it's that that to me seems to be the case. um that we kind of worship these uh yeah money and stuff. Well, we still haven't gotten through suicide yet as a text, which means in all likelihood now, but we have gotten into the questions of religion. We're pretty far into this now. You can't go too far into Durkheim without quite getting into religion. I don't know that there's anything more. I guess there's one more passage I want to make sure to talk about this. Yeah, there's like one more. But uh, in all likelihood, I think what'll happen is we'll spend Wednesday and then Monday again this week talking about the elementary forms of religious life, which means like your quiz and your next assignment will be due Wednesday the 22nd instead of Monday the 20th. Um, this last section here. I wanted to make sure to point out to you because we only got like a couple minutes, but everything else that I've highlighted, I think we've already pretty much like touched on, and so it would be a little redundant. But this last paragraph is the one that's important, where Durkheim sort of labels all of these different suicide, these types of suicide, in terms of how they relate to the social structure, the social system around people. So, he talks about he's talking here about anomic suicide, anomie, here in this previous paragraph, and then he introduces what he calls egoistic suicide. He says that these have kindred ties, so they're like related, um, in the sense that both spring from society's insufficient presence in individuals. And then he goes on to talk about how they're different. He says, but the sphere of its absence is not the same in both cases. He talks about how the egoistic and anomic suicides are different. In egoistic, it is deficient in truly collective activity. So there is basically a lack of what he calls integration. And in anomic suicide, it's basically society's influence is lacking in the basically individual passions, leaving them without a check rein. So in anomic suicide, in other words, it's from a lack of regulation in society, this lack of external control. And so this is where he is basically talking about the difference between them in terms of integration and regulation, these concepts from that we've been talking about the whole time. Up here, he also mentions altruistic suicide, which I mentioned. Altruistic suicide in the sense of like a self-sacrifice. So he says this is a third sort of suicide that results from man's activity lacking regulation and his consequent sufferings. So this altruistic suicide is different in the sense that it comes from these really intense, strong social bonds that the individual sacrifices themselves on behalf of. So next time, we will pick up with the elementary forms of religious life. And in the meantime, make sure that you put your name in the chat if you haven't done so already, so I can count you for attendance. I bid you all a nice, wonderful day, and I will see you on Wednesday. Thank you. Bye.